Change leaders act on economic necessity. Leadership learning. On 15 August 1971, President Richard Nixon announced the end of U.S. dollar convertibility into gold, a move that dismantled the Bretton Woods international monetary system. Delivered via televised address, the decision transformed the dollar into a fiat currency and reshaped global finance. Nixon's unilateral cancellation of direct international convertibility, the act frequently described as cutting the dollar loose from gold, became known as the Nixon shock, one of the most significant economic policy reversals in modern history. The next day, headlines across the world captured the scale of the announcement. The New York Times framed it as a sweeping economic plan, freezing wages and prices, cutting taxes, creating jobs, and most notably, severing the dollar's link to gold. The context was mounting economic pressure. During the 1960s, the United States endured fiscal strain from Vietnam War spending and expanded domestic social programs. At the same time, trade partners such as Germany and Japan accumulated large dollar reserves and kept currencies deliberately undervalued to support export growth. As American gold reserves fell, Nixon acted partly to force surplus nations to revalue, using convertibility suspension as leverage to address inflationary pressure and concerns about the jobless. The decision emerged after 3 days of secret deliberations at Camp David in August 1971, where Nixon and his principal economic advisors debated the nation's monetary future. The gravity of this choice was not lost on key participants. Treasury Secretary John Connally observed in advance, "We may never go back to it, convertibility. I suspect we never will." The move combined political theater with economic brinkmanship, a reminder that leadership often blends public symbolism with technical policy making. Markets reacted almost immediately. Exchange rates began floating freely, producing unprecedented volatility and uncertainty. What had been a stable, predictable exchange rate mechanism suddenly became fluid and market-driven, and currencies moved in response to news and sentiment rather than fixed parities. Countries holding substantial dollar balances found themselves relying on the full faith and credit of the United States rather than tangible gold backing. The consequences reached far beyond technical adjustments. The end of gold convertibility entrenched the dollar's position as the dominant global reserve currency, granting the United States unique privileges, including the ability to run persistent trade deficits, while also creating systemic vulnerabilities tied to U.S. fiscal and monetary policy. The immediate volatility morphed into a new normal for floating exchange regimes, altering how nations conducted trade, managed reserves, and framed monetary policy. The Nixon shock shows how even robust, complex systems can be overturned when economic realities change. Bretton Woods had supplied stability for 2 decades, yet once its foundations eroded, bold intervention became inevitable. The speed and comprehensiveness of the shift and the readiness to defy precedent demonstrate how decisive leadership can reconfigure global structures almost overnight. Change leadership lessons. This historic moment offers profound insights into systemic transformation and the courage required to abandon familiar frameworks when they no longer serve their purpose, representing a huge change and total reset. Nixon's unilateral action, taken despite the risk of international backlash, shows how leaders must sometimes prioritize long-term strategic interests over short-term diplomatic convenience. The enduring consequences of this decision continue to shape global economic relations, monetary policy, and the structure of international finance. Leaders of change recognize when incremental adjustments prove insufficient to address fundamental structural problems requiring comprehensive systemic transformation. They create secure environments for intensive analysis away from external pressures and media scrutiny during critical decision-making processes. Change leaders act unilaterally when circumstances demand immediate intervention rather than seeking consensus that might result in paralyzing organizational delays. They must recognize when underlying conditions make transformation inevitable and act decisively to maintain control over complex transition processes. Leaders of change require intellectual courage to dismantle familiar structures when changing circumstances render their core assumptions fundamentally obsolete. Summary leadership quote: change leaders understand that systemic intervention, not incremental adjustments, is required for transformational change when structures no longer serve their fundamental purpose effectively. Change leadership responsibility. 1. Articulate a change vision. The Nixon shock demonstrates that articulating a compelling change vision requires leaders to confront systemic failure whilst presenting a credible alternative pathway forward. When existing structures become economically unsustainable, the vision must clearly communicate both the necessity for transformation and the potential stability that new approaches can provide. Effective change visions acknowledge current pressures without creating paralyzing uncertainty for stakeholders. Leaders must frame fundamental shifts as inevitable responses to changed realities rather than experimental departures from proven methods. The vision should emphasize long-term organizational sustainability over short-term convenience, ensuring that all stakeholders understand the rationale for abandoning familiar frameworks. This requires transparent communication about underlying conditions that make transformation essential, whilst maintaining confidence in the organization's capacity to navigate complex transitions successfully. The change vision for this situation communicates that abandoning gold convertibility, whilst disruptive, provides essential monetary flexibility to address economic pressures and establish sustainable fiscal foundations for future prosperity. Find out more. Change Management Leadership, Leadership of Change Volume 4,